Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about the social construction of happiness in relation to trans people and sort of the narratives that define us and our representation. This is also going to be a critique of Sara Ahmed's Promise of Happiness, meaning that I'm going to be taking a lot of her arguments, extending them, and creating new insights with her work. If she ends up seeing this somehow, that would be absolutely insane, and I'd love to talk with her more about it. I absolutely recommend this book to everyone watching. It's an incredible read into what we consider happiness, how it's sort of socially constructed, and how these sorts of social constructions of happiness are used to control our behaviors, and how that sort of social control is capable of reinforcing social inequalities within society. It goes over Black civil rights within America, dynamics between migrants and multiculturalism, feminism, traditionally the right to work and stuff like that, and sort of gay resistance to homophobia. However, it avoids any discussion of transphobia, predictably because it was written in 2010. However, I believe that a discussion of the social construction of happiness and how it sort of impacts transphobia and sort of frames trans people is perhaps one of the most interesting case studies, largely because transphobia contains so many elements of racism, sexism, queerphobia, and so on, often with distinct twists. I've heard many trans people describe that we do not have a social role within society. And while I certainly feel the sentiment personally, I don't entirely agree. There's sort of like two opposite social positions for trans people. On one hand, we have traditional transphobia, which is the trans problem or the trans misery narrative. It's the depiction of trans people as ill, deluded, miserable, and causing misery in others. Under this sort of social role, the perfect trans person doesn't exist. We are expected to not transition. And if we do, we are used as sort of props to discourage other people from transitioning. During the period of time that this was dominant, many trans women were only able to survive by ghosting all their family and friends and stealthing in another city without any previous contacts. So while there was an expectation of non-existence, invisibility was sort of a possible way to avoid that. I think the purest example of this I've seen was in a conservative debate panel with Blaire when she tried to defend her politics to Lauren Witzke. The Republican candidate had simply said, "Great, the best thing you can do for us is grow your mustache and tell others not to be like you." The new social role that's emerged for trans people has been that of trans acceptability. It has been an attempt to be visible and demonstrate oneself to be the opposite of ill, deluded, miserable, and causing misery in others. This demands a performance of happiness and total assimilation in order to overcome the previous role, attempting to show that trans people are capable of being compatible with happiness norms. While undoubtedly being a better condition for trans people, it is ultimately unchallenging and it continues to marginalize us. It forces us to live our lives around the demands of cis people and follow a narrow line of acceptable behavior. It changes a lot depending on context, so there is no pure example, but it is marked by proving yourself to be successful, happy, and non-challenging over following your own desires. This is not too dissimilar from the social position of migrants, whose multiculturalism is thought to bring unrest or unhappiness to the population. And hence they are given the social roles of either not migrating or giving up on their own culture to prove their compatibility within the host country's society. The exception being cases in which culture can be commodified for the pleasure of the white majority. Part 1. The Trans Misery Narrative. So, let's get into the actual ideas of the trans misery narrative. Trans misery is the concept set on deterring transition. It associates trans people with unhappiness and uses that to prove that transitioning is wrong. One common way of doing this is through the depiction of transness as an illness or delusion. We are also depicted as undesirable, ugly, or disturbing as a further way to discourage transition as a desirable outcome and discourage others to associate with us. We are depicted as a moral wrong in a very similar trend to homosexuality. Through much of the 20th century, lesbians were allowed to publish their romances and represent homosexuality within literature. But this was only the case if it had a tragic ending, because this was seen to discourage homosexuality. This sort of opportunity wouldn't really be fully possible for trans people. Trans literature would often be centered around memoirs for the entirety of its existence and would often be used to reinforce sentiments of trans people through the time, especially if it wasn't a trans person writing their own biography. In my brief search, I was not able to find any published literature before 2010 that included a trans character and was written by a trans author. Sara Ahmed also brings up the concept of happy objects. These are things or concepts that are objectified to be seen as an object that brings happiness. These can be specific and personal, like a song or a game or even a person, or it can be abstract and societal, such as family or career. When a society deems a happy object, it is often assumed to be universal. And when people don't desire them, don't try to achieve them, or otherwise don't attain these happy objects, they're often stigmatized for that. Trans people often have to give up on these societally constructed happy objects to pursue their own transitions. Many careers are just unattainable for trans people, or much more difficult to enter. And despite a high rate of post-secondary education, trans people face very high disproportionate rates of poverty and unemployment. Trans people often lose their reproductive rights, either because they don't have the financial means to preserve sperm or eggs, or because they transitioned in a time and place where forced sterilization was mandated for trans people. Dating as a trans person is also much harder, especially for straight trans women. When transitioning, many people face the prospect that they may never get married because they transitioned. And even when a trans person has a career, family, or kids, it is common for them to lose any or all of them due to their own transition. And this absence of happy objects, especially for people who are forced to give them up, are used to prove that transitioning is an unhappy and wrong lifestyle. They are routinely used as arguments to deter transition, typically in the form of, even if you want to transition, You will never be happy because you won't have insert happy object. Well, I was told a million times that I shouldn't transition because I'd never find a partner. This has been the least of my concerns, and it's the furthest thing from reality. The relationships I've had since my transition have been the most healthiest for me, the most enjoyable, and the most meaningful relationships that I've had. In summary, happy objects are used as evidence that trans people are giving up on our own futures even when we aren't, and that we will never be happy, all in attempt to discourage us from transitioning, all in attempt to scare people away from the act of transitioning. Part 2, Killjoys. The killjoy is a very popular concept within Sara Ahmed's work, and it's built off the conception of feminists as bitter, miserable, or killjoys, due to how they can disrupt the ability to enjoy products of the status quo. Or, more accurately, they vocalize that many of the things that men enjoy within society actually cause unhappiness in others, whether it's sexist media, oppressive social structures, or just outright abuse of women. In the book, she prompts the reader, does the feminist kill other people's joy by pointing out moments of sexism? Or does she expose the bad feelings that are hidden, displaced, or neglected under public signs of joy? In effect, the label of killjoy is used to put the burden of men's happiness onto women, forcing them to perform happiness even when they're not, and be silent to their own reality. The killjoy narrative is a type of misery narrative that, rather than depicting the minority as miserable, it depicts them as causing misery in others. The trope has been connected to a lot of other minorities and groups, such as the angry Black woman, the angry lesbian, the SJW, and they all often bleed into each other and follow similar trends, though I haven't really heard anyone talk about the trans killjoy in detail before. The trans killjoy is seen to disrupt social order in many of the same ways, except that our existence is often seen as a disruption in and of itself. While cis women are often not allowed to be vocal, trans people are often not allowed to be visible. The existence of trans people is used as evidence of disruption to Western values or disruption to the family structure. However, even when trans women have traditional heterosexual nuclear families, it is still a disruption to the family structure because we are demonized in a way where our existence is seen as harmful to kids. In a similar way, our identities are associated with being upsetting in and of themselves. We ruin public enjoyment of transphobic media and social privileges, and discussing when we are killed or abused is a very huge mood killer, especially when others never really cared at all. When we are able to be vocal, we are seen as being intrusive and taking up too much space, despite that trans people are much less likely to be able to voice their opinions at all. I've gotten numerous comments from cis men who insert themselves into my videos and call me self-absorbed, that I'm taking up too much space and they don't care. The irony being that they're inserting themselves into videos that are pretty much exclusively directed at other trans people. We are associated with disrupting political order even when a trans person doesn't speak or believe in the supposed political changes, because unlike cis women, our existence is deemed political. Jordan Peterson spent years complaining about trans people being added to the Human Rights Code. He argued that it would mandate pronoun policing, despite the Canadian Bar Association explicitly saying the opposite. Speaking of, our existence is seen as mandating others' speech and controlling what they can say because we've got the name and pronouns that we do. This, in the same way, exposes the discomfort that others have with us. When cis people introduce themselves with their names, it isn't seen as controlling speech because it isn't exposing any sort of discomfort that the other person has with their existence. Cis people have no problem in acknowledging the gender of another cis person, but our presence exposes discomfort in others, especially if we don't follow cisnormative beauty standards, if we don't pass, or if we're outside the binary. There are other similar ways of typing us as selfish, unaware, intrusive, or needing of attention. Ultimately, this narrative serves to offer trans people no place within society, associating trans people with misery to discourage transitions, and alienating trans people and forcing them into invisibility. But Part 3, the trans acceptability narrative. The emerging challenge to the trans problem, or the trans misery narrative, has been to show trans happiness, trans success, and trans acceptability, while certainly not being the only movement of trans activism. It was motivated both by genuine activism and by large media corporations. When all trans people could be seen as were miserable, ill, deluded, fetishistic, and all of that, a lot of trans people just wanted to be seen as anything else, to not be forced entirely into invisibility and shame. At the same time, media corporations were having a lot more easy of a time platforming trans visibility when it first and foremost sought cis acceptability over everything else. Around the same time, trans activism inadvertently became a lot more white and a lot more upper class and a lot more privileged all around. This is because before then, well-off white trans people were really the only people that got access to the limited forms of gender-affirming surgeries and treatments, and they would be much, much better off going stealth. So there was no real reason that they'd sacrifice their position as a stealth person to engage within trans activism. Meanwhile, low-income and often Black trans women were the most visible and most impacted by transphobia. But well-off trans women in the past fit the acceptability narrative much better, especially if they were white, because whiteness was and still is assumed to be the norm and is a lot less challenging to white cis audiences. But through this sort of representation, transness inherently became associated with whiteness, which continues to adversely affect trans people of color beyond the lack of representation. There's also many, many forms of the trans acceptability narrative that can be found. First, there's the talk show trans narrative that really sort of echoes the born in the wrong body, sort of argument and framing of trans people. It largely emerged out of the 2000s, though of course the narrative dates back further than that. It created a really oversimplified and constrained framing of us to make us justifiable and understandable to cis audiences, and hence make us a lot more acceptable to cis people. The narrative is most famously represented by white celebrities, usually when they're given opportunities to speak about their transition on talk shows or whatever else. It creates a simple A to B framing of transition that ends after surgery. These sorts of narratives also typically use trans people as inspirational props to give them a place within society. Similarly, in pop media, you typically see a lot of narratives that sort of lump trans people in with free expression movements. It sort of justifies trans people by including them in a movement that isn't explicitly trans, while attempting to liberate us from the traditional medical model of transition. It tends to reduce trans people to how we dress and how we perform our expression for others. It sees little difference between trans women and photo ops of Harry Styles in a dress. This movement gets the closest to being societally challenging, but only through consumer culture without any sort of socio-political substance to it. The movement also intrinsically associates trans people with their birth sex still. Like a trans woman in a dress is still seen as like free expression, non-conforming, whatever, but a masculine or butch trans woman is just ignorable. It's largely because this movement doesn't see trans women as fully women. It sees trans women dressing hyperfeminine in a similar context to cross-dressing. The movement also tries to confront the dysphoria narrative by exclusively focusing on gender euphoria and trans joy. However, this is equally alienating to a large amount of trans people who don't experience these sorts of emotions and doesn't represent many trans people's lives. In opposition to this, you've got the anti-SJW or edgy trans people. These people typically try to attain their acceptability through separating themselves from other trans people or proving themselves to be the cool trans person that doesn't get upset when confronted with transphobia. Uniquely, they pretty much exclusively focus on opposing the killjoy narratives that trans people make other people miserable, but they don't oppose trans misery. Largely, this is because they still believe and uphold the belief that transness or gender dysphoria is a mental illness, but they offer medical transition as a clear solution to that, meaning that transition creates happiness. They are most commonly represented by figures such as Blaire, Kalvin, Garrah, Miss London, or Ella Grant. This is often through the desire to separate yourself from cringy or not respected individuals within your own community, and because it offers a group to blame, but it also can be the product of external forces. Allegedly, Storm Ryan was groomed by Ariel Scarcella to be her sort of token of proof that she wasn't transphobic and that what she said was reasonable. People use politics, the gender binary, trans medicalization, or insensitivity and anything else they can think of as justification to separate themselves from other trans people. I think it's important to acknowledge that this narrative has caused a lot of harm in the past, specifically with figures such as Kalvin Garrah, but it's also often not taken to the same extreme as Kalvin Garrah. There's many people who just serve to function as the token cool trans friend to gain acceptability. It's a very, very common narrative within the trans internet space, so I'm very sure I'll get lots of comments from members of my audience who belong to it. Of course, there's many forms of the trans acceptability narrative, and they're all quite distinct from one another, but they are all united by the fact that they seek first and foremost acceptability and performance of happiness norms for cis people over their own personal desires and beliefs. Part 4. The Performance of Acceptability. The performance of happiness norms contains multiple different trends of how someone is expected to behave. First is obviously that trans people are expected to convey happiness pretty much at all times which they are visible. This is because our own happiness is used as a metric to determine whether our transitions are successful or not, or whether transitioning is a positive experience. This often comes at the expense of being able to convey your own emotions that aren't happiness, and being able to discuss struggles that are completely unrelated to transition. This often makes our own representation alienating and inhuman when the only examples of ourselves we see are people that can't convey human emotion and can't convey human struggles. So too is there a demand to be accomplished, be the model minority, and show trans excellence. This is because trans people are often held to higher standards to show their success, especially because we've given up on many of these happy objects. We either need to be incredibly high achieving, or we need to demonstrate that we never gave up on any of those to transition. So too is an acceptable trans person supposed to be non-challenging. This means we don't get in social conflicts, we don't meaningfully address politics, and it means we don't diverge from cis norms. If it is considered challenging for a trans person to exist within a gendered space, then they should not. To be acceptable means to not be seen as an angry trans woman, which means we are demanded to not correct others and not voice our own emotions when we are misgendered or outright harassed. Especially since conflict is deemed masculine, we often lose the conflict and justify being misgendered by engaging in conflict at all. The one trans woman in GameStop is a key example of that. She was done insanely dirty by the media. She had already politely corrected the employee numerous times, and it was evidently clear that the GameStop employee had continually been saying "sir" to deliberately misgender and anger her. But one moment of anger caught on film was justification for everyone to turn against her. A large part of the equation, too, is that acceptability demands cisnormativity. Passing also means a lot when other people decide the value and the acceptability of us as trans people. Passing is used to gauge whether we can be taken seriously or whether we're worth respect. If someone is seen as not passing, that is often taken to mean that they're not trying and they're not really the gender that they are. Cis heterosexual beauty standards are huge in being able to prove your acceptability, which is why so much of our representation, especially online, is with makeup gurus and models. Trans people are also largely discouraged from talking about politics unless it's entirely performative. If you want to be on a large media platform, you pretty much can only talk about things that aren't of core concern to trans people, because substantial changes are threatening and they're not as easily able to be sensationalized unless they're weaponized against us. Trans acceptability is also so reliant on catering to cis people at the expense of your own dignity. It takes many forms, whether you're being used as sensational entertainment, whether you're being forced to answer incredibly condescending questions, or whether you're serving as a demeaning inspiration prop. But ultimately, trans visibility is only valid when they are visible explicitly for cis people. Ultimately, the demands of trans acceptability change with time. Like in recent years, displaying your pronouns has become unchallenging and acceptable, and in many cases is now demanded of trans people. But the overall structure and expectations have stayed the same, meaning that trans people are expected to perform their happiness for cis people and prove themselves to be compatible with happiness norms over expressing their own emotions and experiences genuinely.
Part 5. So what now?
I don't think this is trans liberation. I think at a certain point we need to break free and show diversity outside of performative happiness. We need to challenge the assumption that only through being compatible with society and its norms that we can justify our transitions. We need to let go of norms and performative expectations to prove our own happiness. We should be able to justify our own transitions because they are right for us and that's what we chose. And we shouldn't have to continue to create a fake mask of happiness of all trans people at all moments to comfort the privileged and allow them to maintain their own ignorance. And ultimately, there are greater values than what society deems is happiness for us. We should be able to authentically convey our own emotions, desires, and what we want to do for ourselves. In her book, Sara Ahmed points out that stay-at-home moms are statistically happier than working women, but she argues that this doesn't mean that those women are worse off, and it doesn't invalidate their decisions to choose to work. And being able to choose your own outcomes, despite how it impacts your own happiness, is a form of liberation. Ultimately, there is a large range of behavior and choices that are outside of misery and a performance of happiness that we should be able to choose for ourselves. Liberation can be found in choosing how you display your own emotions and act, and why you act, and what for. This is especially the case when we as trans people spend so much time policing the optics of other trans people and their behaviors and what they do and what they say and how they describe their experiences, because it doesn't entirely align with cis acceptability. It hides transgender nonconformity, and it controls how we tell our stories and controls how we are visible. Allowing more complicated stories and experiences and having conversations that center ourselves as the audiences are important. being able to have more advanced conversations without appealing to the lowest common denominator of an uninformed cis person, allowing for diversity and not telling our stories to be acceptable, but telling our stories because they authentically represent ourselves and our experiences, and giving accurate accounts and information for new trans people so they don't feel alienated when they don't perfectly align with a trans acceptability narrative. So it's okay to make decisions for ourselves, even when they don't clearly lead to an objectively happier reality. It's okay to define your own values, and it's okay for those values to be outside of societal norms. And it's okay to represent your experiences and your emotions authentically, even when they are less acceptable to a cis audience. I hope you all enjoyed this and that it was informative. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts and perspective in the comments. And of course, I would love to have you follow along if you are interested in more content like this. And for the first time ever, I've got the honor of thanking my Patreon supporters. It's an insane experience, and I incredibly appreciate your support. You may see many of my Patreon supporters on screen right now. It helps me a lot, and I'm able to put a lot more time and effort into these videos than I otherwise would have. As you may have noticed, I've been able to buy myself a pair of glasses for the first time due to the financial security that you've given me, and I've been in desperate need of them for a good while now. Thank you so much for your support beyond like the financial support, just the regular support that everyone gives me. It's insane and it means a lot to me. I hope you all have a great day, and I will talk to you later.